Welcome to Flashback to a Fabulous Future. We are on a journey to understand the past so that we can move forward into the future with focus and energy. Welcome, everybody. Glad to be with you today. And today we have a very special guest, Paul Vecchione, and he's with the P.R.E.P Academy. And I'll let him introduce himself and tell us a little bit about what he does in his organization.
Awesome. So hi, Cheryl. Hi, everybody. Great to be here today. I'm on the Eastern time zone here right after school. I'm a school teacher on Long Island. And I've also got a company for substance abuse prevention and mental health awareness, Long Island P.R.E.P. I created Long Island P.R.E.P about 5 years ago, which, we were kind of right before COVID when the opioid crisis was raging high, and then kind of dipped a bit. And then obviously after the pandemic, here we are. We're still dealing with a lot of drug overdose and a lot of mental health issues across the country. So, between my experience as a teacher, working with kids, having my own kids, and, just being kind of motivated to get the next generation on a better footing than I think we are here today. So, I saw Cheryl's description for her podcast and it sounded really interesting. So here we are.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So does Long Island P.R.E.P, do you venture outside of Long Island with your organization?
That's a great question. So yes, we do. We have our cohort of contracts and stuff here on Long Island. And I actually my wife just began something called P.R.E.P National, which will be, going beyond the borders of Long Island and New York. It's funny because people I've spoken to around the country are like, that's probably a good idea. For some reason, there's a negative, I don't know, connotation when people hear New York and Long Island in some parts of the country, not all, but so no, it was a strategic business decision to, kind of open it up a bit and make our services available around the country because as we know, these issues are impacting people everywhere.
They are. And I think they've been impacting us for a long time. And I think we're unfortunately a couple of generations into this. I know that I grew up in Wyoming along the I-80 corridor. And unfortunately, one of the things that area where I grew up in is known for is a lot of drugs. And
Right.
you get into the smaller communities, smaller towns, people are always like, oh, well, there's nothing for kids to do. So that's what they do. They go party and they go do drugs and things. I'm like, what happened to, a couple hundred years ago when everything was small town USA or small town whatever, and they didn't have entertainment. I think we look at kids and we think that if they don't have entertainment, they don't have anything to do. So can you talk a little bit about that from your perspective?
Of course. And, I'm 44 and the internet and video games and all the stuff, I guess, that kids use today for what we call, I guess, entertainment didn't exist when I was, 9, 10, 12 years old growing up, even as, as a teenager. So we had to be outside. We had to be with our friends. We had to be on the ball field or playing manhunt, whatever with the neighborhood kids. And I think, with the invention of the internet, and I caught the tail end of it when I was in high school and college. We still had like AOL Instant Messenger was how we used the internet to communicate, but come 2007, 2008, when the iPhone was created and kind of put to market, I think a lot of kids started or stopped interacting with each other and started watching each other, on these social media platforms. The whole world did. And, we kind of shifted to, paying a lot of attention to what we were doing online as opposed to what we were doing in person, and just to kind of comment on what you were talking about with small town America and, the fact that you grew up where you did. A lot of the reason why this crisis with, in terms of drugs and stuff are going on is because a lot of those towns were targeted, by the pharmaceutical companies, to get their product to market. The unfortunate thing is they addicted a lot of people. And like you said, we're, generations into this thing now. So I think a lot of forces kind of came together at once. And it's 2024 and, these things are still with us.
They are. And I unfortunately, well, fortunately, I read a book, unfortunate what the topic was. It was about
Right.
how a lot of the drug cartels out of Mexico in particular would target Appalachia and other small
Mhm.
towns. And I live in Virginia now, so I'm very familiar with the whole Appalachia area. And, they started by getting people from the coal mines and things. It's not necessarily youth, but saying, okay, you have some pain from, your years. But where I grew up in Wyoming, it was very similar. We had trona mines instead of coal mines. And,
Mhm.
when you work in those types of environments, it's not at all uncommon for people to get injured. And when they do, then be given opioids, which,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know, was sold as the gold standard of pain relief. And then ended up just being a gateway drug to heroin and to black tar heroin and things like that. And
Mhm.
it just, it's really sad. It's somewhat beyond my comprehension that there can be people out there that go into this with that type of mentality. And let me tell you another little story about when I was growing up, and we can talk a little bit more because I want to really focus on youth today. Is I also grew up in Alaska. I moved around a lot when I was a kid, but almost everywhere I lived was very rural. And I'm a little bit older than you, so not a whole lot of difference between when we were growing up, but definitely we didn't have even, I mean, the phone on the wall was hooked up to a cord, and we had party lines, if you can believe it. You pick up the phone, you hear somebody else's conversation. So
Right.
we didn't use the phone a lot unless we had
Mhm.
to. And we organized our own little sports teams, and we didn't have organized sports for kids and things like that. And in the process, I've often said that it was really good for us because not only did we learn how to play sports and how to cooperate as a team, but we also learned how to make our own rules, how to enforce our own rules, team building, cooperation, all these kind of things that come from, they say all these great things come from organized sports. And I'm like, well, I believed that for a while, but now I'm kind of changing my tune a little bit. And but despite that, I grew up in the 70s in Alaska in the early 70s. Despite the fact that we had this very free and open opportunity to go visiting friends and playing, and my parents, didn't watch us super close, and I didn't have to worry about being kidnapped and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Drugs were
Yep.
still prevalent. Drugs were still very prevalent in the early 70s up in Alaska where I was at. And why is that? Where's all this coming from?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that as long as there's a demand for drugs, there's always going to be a supply. That's why I chose to go down the road for prevention. Addiction is one of the most difficult things to. I mean, there's no cure for it. You're not going to take a pill I mean, there's no set way to get somebody off of, illicit substances. But my whole approach really focuses on, well, let's not even go down that road. Let's educate people on the dangers, on the warning signs. If a child comes from a household where addiction runs in the family, let's make them aware of things, so they can kind of look out for themselves, and the parents can have information that will help them kind of guide their kids down the right path. Because coming from the education world, in my opinion, having the knowledge of something, it gives you the power to then make informed decisions that can really have significant ramifications for kids, for parents. So I think drugs have always been around. Drugs have been, whether it's alcohol or opium, drugs have been around for millennia. Why are people taking them today more than they have been, let's say, 100, 200 years ago? And I think the answer to that is, people have a different state of mind these days. There's more, mental health and substance abuse are brother and sister. One is the cause of the other, and vice versa. So when there's some reason why somebody feels the need to take drugs, there's always going to be the opportunity to. So we have to figure out how to get to a point where we're not going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. And I facilitate a addiction and recovery group on Sunday afternoons, um, for women, and they're adults. They're not
Mhm.
children, but it doesn't really matter. A lot of times drugs fill an unmet need in people. So how does your program and how do you deal with that aspect of it?
Great point. Great point. Yeah, right there. People are, filling a void. And it was put to me like this one day, and it just stuck with me, and it makes sense. If you're lost in the woods and you fall in a hole and you dig yourself out of a hole, you're still lost in the woods, right? So let's put, people on a path where they have meaning in their lives, where they have things to have hope for, things to look forward to, connection. Somebody put it to me, another way that, the opposite of addiction is connection. So when people feel fulfilled, when people feel like their lives have a purpose, and they don't have to resort to other ways to get joy or fill a void, and that could be a lot of things. That could be, meaning for people means a lot of things, right? It could be exercise, it can be, a good hobby, good relationships, family relationships. So what we try to do is, kind of set people up in a kind of state of mind that, hey, everybody struggles, everybody has issues in their lives. So let's get you down a path where you're dealing with them in a positive way versus having to go down that road of alcohol or drugs to fill that void.
Yeah, I think another thought that comes to my mind is you're, sharing this information is, and this probably is more relevant to inner city, I think, than, rural America, is oftentimes, their kids are latchkey kids. They don't have a lot of supervision. Both parents work, and a lot of times, one
Mm-hmm.
parent may work in the day and the other in the night. And so these kids are unfortunately free to run. And
Mm-hmm.
so there, it opens up doors of unfortunately, it opens up doors of opportunities for them to meet with people that they probably shouldn't be, associating with. I'm not saying that doesn't happen in rural America, because it does, but um, how do you work with kids on that level?
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. And we could go back to when we were kids. Everybody always says, "Well, when I was growing up, this was never the case." I think, and it's true. Society has changed. Mom and dad both have to work these days. I mean, I'm not sure about you, but when I was growing up, my dad was at work, but my mom was home, and we have, I have three siblings. Mom was always home to, take us off the bus and make sure we had a snack after school, and dinner was at 5 o'clock when dad came home, and we had to sit there and interact with one another, right? And that family unit is really what kept myself, my siblings, and a lot of my friends, intact. So that's definitely different today. And again, keeping kids involved in things that are going to have positive influence on them. Let them figure out a way, something that's going to, make them feel good about themselves, give them confidence and self-esteem, whether that's sports, whether that's art, whether that's expressive communication, music, youth groups, things that are going to keep kids in a position where, they have a good support system around them, and the opportunity to kind of stray off, and kind of partake in some of these negative activities maybe isn't their first choice anymore. So that's really the purpose of the message that we're trying to get across, and that has all to do with education and information. If people are immersed in that mindset, then maybe we can make a difference or two.
Yeah. Another thought I have is, you know, I went to my church group, youth group, when I was young, and a lot of the Wednesday night activities that we engaged with were, entertainment type activities. And they really pushed a lot of entertainment type activities, for lack of a better word. Um, but I noticed that the church that I attend with my kids, and they're pretty much grown adults now, but even more so with the next generation, is they're really focusing on teaching these kids to serve and to go out into the community and to interact with the community and to help other people, because they found that by entertaining kids, it's kind of a self-serving kind of attitude that they develop. And a lot of times these issues with kids, whether they're full-blown addiction or not, is it's self-serving. And when you're looking outside
Yeah.
yourself, it's harder to, to be self-serving. So
Absolutely. That's a great point. And there was a Harvard study, forget the year, but it was definitely recent, acts of kindness and doing things for others is actually more rewarding for the person doing the act as opposed to the person taking on the act, right? So when we serve others, when we help others, when we're being kind to others, it actually benefits us more than in terms of the brain chemistry and, maybe some of the science I don't totally understand, but, we feel better about ourselves when we're helping other people. So, the church groups, the outreach, the work inside of communities to help others. Yeah, those are all positive alternatives to all of these things, and that's part of what we're trying to get across, get this message across that, hey, and kids are going to be kids. There's always going to be the opportunity for a kid to experiment in something. There's always going to be a drug or a drink around. But when when it becomes problematic and when it becomes consuming to that child in their lives, and then they go down the wrong path, we're trying to prevent that. We're trying to get the information and the, basic, general message out there that, hey, there's better things to do with your time, and there's better things to serve, better ways to serve yourself and your community that will keep you off these things.
Yeah, and when you live in these unfortunate family situations, sometimes whether, a single parent or even sometimes no parent, I mean, you may have an adult, figure in your life, but it may not necessarily be your parent, is that you can serve within your family and learning to take care of your siblings or, those around you, or even, say you're being raised by your grandmother or something, and she's not able to do all the things that a younger parent would be able to do. Maybe you can help her out, that type of thing. But it also leads me to this other topic that I know, we've shared a little bit back and forth in email about, is resilience. And a lot of times kids will engage with drugs because they deal with disappointment and they can't, handle those disappointments in life. And so they turn to something to make themselves feel better, but doesn't make them feel better about themselves, but at least temporarily it makes them feel better. So how, in your mind, how do we raise resilient kids?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and that comes down to coping skills and self-esteem and confidence. Because look, when the kids have the tools and they have the strength to stare down these issues and not feel the need to resolve them with a drink or a drug, they're just better off in the world. They have the resilient skills, and kids are resilient by nature. I mean, especially the younger they are, I think, things happen, and kids have that ability to bounce back, especially if they have the support around them that they need. Because look, there's no more important thing to a kid than a good, solid support group, whether it's family, friends, school, community, church, you name it. So I think keeping people, especially kids, with a good support group around them with positive influence really goes a long way. But when you talk about resilience, when those things are in place, it's a lot easier for them to bounce back. It's a lot easier, for them to stare down and, kind of overcome the urge, I guess, to fill that void with a drink or a drug. Because again, when there's more meaning and there's more connection and there's more positive interactions, those are the gloss over to making a child feel better and feel like they're able to overcome challenges without having to resort to drugs.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that I know me personally, I grew up in a family of high achievers. And I don't mean this to be self-deprecating here, but somewhat. I wasn't one of those high achievers. I just wasn't. And growing up in that type of family, it was really hard for me because I was always comparing myself to my siblings. And I know we live in a world where we give kids a ribbon for everything and we tell them how wonderful
Mhm.
they are, even when they're not wonderful sometimes, and it is incredibly tempting to think that that builds self-esteem. But what I found in my own life
Right.
personally was that because I had to work for everything that I achieved in life compared to my siblings and other family members, when I got out in the real world, I was far more resilient and I was able
Mhm.
to face those challenges with a different level of success. And even, one of my older brother has said at times, he says, I was for years and years because he was the captain of the football team. He was the quarterback. He was on, honor society. He was this, that, and the other thing. He says, well, when I was, growing up, I was the big fish in a little pond, and now I'm a little fish in a big pond, and I don't know how to deal with that. He's had some challenges because of it. So I think that having kids, don't try to eliminate those types of experiences that would challenge your kids. And instead of just, telling them how great they are and how wonderful they are, help them find the tools necessary to be successful. And the other thing I noticed too was my husband, who is extremely intelligent and gifted and that kind of thing. He kind of said the same thing. He's had a harder time as he's gotten out in the world because of that. And he's got ADHD, adult ADD, whatever you want to call it, and a pretty bad case of it. He'll admit to that. And I grew up playing the piano, and I wasn't that I was a great piano player, but he looks and he's like, I recognize how much you learned, not just musically playing the piano, but the discipline of having to play the piano every day and to take something that might be hard. Because my sister was really good at music. I wasn't. I had to practice a lot more to achieve the same level. And he says, when you do that, he says, you learn to build those kind of skills. I know kids with ADHD, one of the primary characteristics, not primary, but, outgrowth from it is that if they don't like something, they won't do it. And so,
yeah,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, so I'm sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, no, I was just going to say I couldn't agree more. I think that kids are in especially teenagers, they're in that gray area where they're not children anymore, but they're not yet adults. But I think there has to be that period of time where kids have to discover what's challenging for them, and that they have to kind of learn how to deal with uncomfortable feelings, whether it's with friendships, socially, sexually, growing up in, difficult situations, maybe not being accepted, maybe being bullied. And those are life lessons for, after high school and, when we become adults. And I'll give you the other side of that. I grew up in a household where we were only supported and had a great, healthy environment to flourish in. And then when I got older, and there was some adversity in my life, I had to learn how to deal with it from an adult perspective because I didn't really have to learn how to deal with it as a child. So in a way, I kind of wished I had, because then I would have been better at it when I was an adult. Now I was able to come through it, but it took some trial and error, and it took some hard times to to get through those times. So when you speak about, especially, children with, disabilities like ADHD or, I guess any kind of learning disability, or, cognitive disability, that's even harder for them, because think about like all the challenges in life that everybody goes through, and now having that on top of it, to kind of navigate through. And, it's been kind of studied and suggested that, children with these kinds of disabilities have a harder time in school, have a harder time socially, and some of that, may lead them down, the path toward, substances and alcohol, because it's just easier to get high or drunk than it is to deal with some of these problems. So that's definitely another piece of it, and that's something that has to be addressed also.
Yeah, and I also think, kind of going back to the, every kid gets a ribbon kind of thing, and we're so focused on, telling our kids how great they are, that I think we do a disservice there. My youngest did have a learning disability, and he really struggled in school, and we had to go through all kinds of interventions to try to make sure that when he graduated, that he was, could go out into the work world and face those challenges. But he was very good at football. He was exceptionally good at football. And I remember a couple times him coming home, because he got moved up to varsity when he was a sophomore, which I highly disagreed with. Told the coaches I didn't like it. He wasn't mature enough. I didn't think he was ready for that. Sure, he could play. He was big enough. He was strong enough, but he wasn't emotionally ready for that level of interaction. And the coaches got really frustrated with him a lot of times because he couldn't learn the plays as quickly as the other kids. And, I'm like, the kid has a learning disability. I did try to tell you this.
Right.
And, he'd come home and he'd be like, oh, all they did was yell at me all day long. And, football coaches, call me names and all kinds of stuff. And, I could have went to the coach and said, hey, you quit calling him names. He's got a learning disability. I mean, I already said that up front. I'm not going to go through it, and be in the coach's office all the time saying that. So I just told him, I said, well, do you see them yelling at other kids like that? He goes, well, not particularly. I said, well, in particular, do you see him yelling at the kids on the sidelines? And he's like, no. And I said, well, unfortunately, I mean, I don't agree with that type of approach, but the fact that he is yelling at you says that he sees potential in you. And after that, he was kind of like, wow, I think you're right. And so he started taking notice. And when he got out in the work world, and he's an electrician now, and the construction world can be brutal, it's kind of the same thing. He's working for bosses that were on his case and, getting after him and stuff. And he's like, okay, this means they must like me. This means they must want to develop me. Especially in the construction world nowadays, it's hard to keep people. And so they would rather, sometimes, their methods aren't the best, but hey, he's learned to be resilient in that way and to let a lot of that bounce off. He doesn't need constant, telling him how wonderful he is but I also think, he called me the other day, and his boss had given him a letter, saying, how much, because they don't do performance evaluations and things like that. But his boss had actually wrote him a letter saying how much he appreciated him and how well he thought he was doing. And think about how much that means. If you're getting a ribbon all the time, those kind of things don't mean anything. This meant a lot to him.
Absolutely. And of course, that goes back to, kids have to go through adversity to learn, and kids have to go through, if we're giving everybody a ribbon or a trophy, what are we really teaching them? And I think especially with youth sports, it's gotten to a point, I'm not sure if it's where in your neck of the woods, but around here, youth sports have become like, the major leagues. And sorry, I don't think a 9, a 10, and 11-year-old should be, kind of put in that kind of situation, because at that age, they're just supposed to be learning. So what are we teaching kids by telling them, everything you do is great, and it doesn't matter how you performed, you're still a star. Well, not everybody's a star. Not everybody's supposed to be a star. So, part of society and part of learning and teaching kids is weeding out the kids who should be on the field and who shouldn't. And that's not a bad thing, because that teaches them a life lesson that, hey, to get ahead and to be good and to do something well, I've got to work and be better than that next person. So, I couldn't agree more with what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think as children and as parents, we can say to them, hey, either if you're not the star of the basketball team, you have a choice. You can either work really hard to become the star, if that's the route you want to go, or you can say after you've completed your season. I don't believe in quitting in the middle of a season per se, unless there's some real justified reason for that. Is okay, maybe we don't play basketball next year. Basketball's just not your thing. Let's go try to find something else. So I think giving kids options, helping them realize that you don't have to be the best basketball player on the floor, and finding things that are of interest to you, things you like to do. And it's okay. I find this odd. And in a book I wrote about, this topic, I think we need to quit trying to help our kids. How does it go? We always ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? Instead of who do you want to be when you grow up? Right. And there's a huge difference. Do you want to be a doctor, a lawyer? Of course, everybody wants to be a doctor, lawyer, professional athlete, make a lot of money, do all this kind of thing. But who do you want to be? What kind of person do you want to be?
Yeah. And who does that fall on? That falls on the parents, that falls on the teachers, that falls on character. I mean, we have to teach kids, you're right, to want to be a certain kind of person. And then what you want to be might be a little clearer.
Yeah. And there's no reason why when you're 9 or 10 years old, you have to decide what you want to be when you grow up and devote your life to it, kind of thing. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think kids need options. I think that they have to be given the freedom to figure out for themselves what they love and how they want to be in life. And the best thing we can do is support them, but I don't think it should be our job as parents and teachers to force it on them. They've got to come to these realizations themselves. And when that happens, it's like self-awareness and what I can and can't do, and then they're on a better path, you know?
Yeah. And keep going back to when I was a kid kind of stories, but I don't remember my parents ever saying, you know, here, let's sit down and fill out your college application to go to whatever school they wanted me to go to. Or I don't even, they basically told me, you want to go to college? Great, we'll help you. You don't want to go to college? Fine, that's okay
Right.
too. And, I never remember them saying, hey, I think you should grow up to be, this, that, or the other thing. I I had my own interests and they pretty much left me alone to figure out my path. They were there to help me and
Yeah.
support me. They didn't just abandon me
Right.
and say, hey, go figure it out and whatever. But that it was up to me. That was part of
Yeah.
growing up.
It's part of growing up, and it helps you learn a lot about yourself. And to some degree, it's like we have this two things, these two slogans as a teacher that stuck with me. I'm a educator now for 20 years. The first one is, they'll never remember what you taught them, but they'll also never forget how you treated them. That's one. And the other is, you chop them down and then you help them up, right? So kids are going to make mistakes. Kids are always going to be, doing something maybe they shouldn't be doing, whether it's academically, socially, behaviorally. But, and the whole role of an adult is to, explain to them what they've done wrong and then help them down the right path, because that's how they learn. And when you learn, that's when that's when you're better off. So, I actually, I commend parents who have the same mindset, I guess, as your parents did, because look, it kind of forced you to do your own thing, but in a way, it didn't force you at all. It was just a natural progression for you,
Yeah. And this one's not when I was a kid, but when I had kids, slightly different twist. I often said
Right.
to my kids, I don't expect you to be perfect. And as a matter of fact, if you're going to make mistakes, I hope you make them while you're living under my roof, because you
Right.
have me to
Yeah.
come to, and I want you to come to me. And I want you to, because
Yeah.
don't be afraid to come to me when you've made mistakes. And I don't care how
Yeah.
serious mistakes are. I want you to come to me and talk to me so we can work through these things. But final question, since we both love history.
Yeah.
All right. How can learning history help kids be more resilient?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, what's a better teacher than history? I mean, you can go through it. And, that was my whole thing so if you go through just like the second half of the 20th century in the United States with, so like the tobacco companies, right? So in 1950, they had doctors, in ads telling people it's okay to smoke cigarettes. And then the Surgeon General came out in the early 60s and said, well, it's not okay to smoke cigarettes, but they still marketed their product to kids for another 50 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Joe Cool was on the billboard outside of the elementary school, and it took a long time, a lot of government intervention and things, but finally they were held accountable, they had to pay, and the whole message around tobacco has changed. So, but what went on for a very long time and got a lot of people addicted to cigarettes and tobacco and nicotine was this idea of corporate greed over public health. And it's literally the same roadmap that was followed for the opioid crisis, where people, they didn't care about the effect it would have on people. They just cared about their bottom line. So, history is the best teacher. And my whole thing was, let's learn from the mistakes of the past, where we didn't learn from the tobacco fiasco. Now we should take the opioid crisis and say, okay, this is where we messed up. This is what we missed. These are the signals we missed, and this is what we didn't do. The next time one of these things comes around, we have the lessons now. They're imprinted in our psyche and in our history books. Let's take what happened here and make the next thing that's coming along here a much better outcome for people, for kids, and for everybody else.
Yeah, thank you. I think you brought up a valuable idea that I don't think you necessarily intended to, was we always think of history as ancient history. History doesn't have to be ancient history. And history is not. I mean, a lot of teachers teach it this way. My favorite way to teach history is to teach stories, to tell stories,
Mhm.
just like you did, to tell a story. People want to hear stories. They want to learn from those stories. And that to me is, whether I read a book and I read about somebody maybe in ancient history that was really resilient and stuck with things, and that kind of motivated me to do that. Or just like you said, what can we learn? What can we learn from COVID? COVID is not ancient history. What
Right.
lessons can we take from that, not only from a medical perspective, but from the youth really suffered tremendously during this time.
Yeah, they
And what
did.
go ahead.
No, I mean, again, I'm not sure how it was by you, but I'm here in New York, and those first couple of months of COVID were intense. I mean, everything was shut down. We didn't leave our homes for 4, 5, and 6 weeks at a time, and it was tough. And I had two young boys that we had to keep educated while we were educating. Right, both my wife and I are teachers, so we had to teach during the day on Zoom. We had to have our kids sitting at a computer screen on Zoom, teaching and learning. And it's like you look back. And it probably didn't have to be that way. It probably didn't have to be that draconian or that intense. So maybe, next time we learn a lot more about something before we force people to really change how they live their lives. Because thank God my kids were young enough where I think they will be resilient. They are resilient enough to not really have been impacted as much. But if you go through like the middle school population and the high school population, that left a stain. I think that they were impacted tremendously. It's going to take them a long time to recover.
Yeah, and I think debriefing is what we call it in the corporate world, or military language, I guess. Whenever something happens, even a week ago with your kids, that's history. A week ago, having that debrief. What happened? How can we do things differently? Even if it was a success, what success can we take from it? And so
Right.
History is valuable, and I think we need to get rid of that negative mindset that so many people have, because for years and years all we were taught were dates and places,
Yeah.
and that doesn't resonate. That doesn't mean a lot to people. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree more, Cheryl. This is a great discussion. And let's learn from our mistakes. That's what I think history is there to do. Yes, we're to learn about it, but let's learn from it too.
Exactly. So before we close, any final thoughts?
No, again, I hope things around your neck of the woods, and I keep saying that. Are you in Wyoming right now?
Nope, I'm in Virginia.
Oh, Virginia. All right, that's right. You said that. So it's a little closer to home for me, but look, we have a lot going on with our kids, with our parents, with these dual crises, with the mental health and the substance abuse. So my last thought is I hope people are starting to come around the bend here and pay. We really have to pay attention to them. We are the gatekeepers of our future, of our children's future, and when we hand the keys over, it's up to us to hand them a better place, and really help them through some of these really difficult times. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you. You want to leave any contact information for people if they want to learn more about your organization? Or
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so they can just go to www.longislandprep.org. You can find my email there. You can find more about our services. I have a podcast, missionzpodcast.com. The Prep Academy is for adults and educators to have professional development, and some workshops to help adults learn about these things. And we are really taking an all-encompassing approach here because we have a lot of work to do, and it really does start with us, all of us.
Yes, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it. You're on a mission, and that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Cheryl. Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, thank you.